We have often said that truth these days is stranger than fiction, but the events of today, frankly, take the biscuit. The central allegation tonight is essentially this, that the man who is about to become leader of the free world could be vulnerable to blackmail by the Russians.
It's all fake news. It's phony stuff. It didn't happen. And it was gotten by opponents of ours.
The implications are simply enormous. If it is fake, then world politics is being perverted on an extraordinary scale. And if it's true, then we would really never have seen anything like it. Also on News at 10 tonight. A new war of words on the health service. The boss of NHS England takes on the Prime Minister. A bit later than usual, winter finally sweeps in. And a dedicated follower of fashion, a new discovery and what it tells us about Queen Elizabeth I.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's Real News at 10. Why real? Well, in his first news conference since long before the election, President-elect Trump poured scorn on what he called fake news. He used the phrase to rubbish potentially devastating claims in a leaked intelligence dossier about perverted sex with prostitutes in a Moscow hotel room. Sounds ludicrous? Well, maybe, but the dossier was prepared by a former MI6 officer and its claims were considered sufficiently serious to be included in a briefing to the current president and, of course, to Mr. Trump himself. The implication, in essence, is that the soon-to-be leader of the free world was groomed by a hostile foreign power and possibly left vulnerable to blackmail. Mr. Trump himself said all this was like living in Nazi Germany, and the allegations, he added, had to be untrue because he was a germaphobe.
Amid a real atmosphere of crisis management, the president-elect arrived to fight back against the explosive allegations swirling around him. He stood there flanked by his daughter and son, before launching his attack on the stories, which are based on leaked information from US spy agencies.
And I think it's a disgrace that information would be let out. I saw the information, I read the information outside of that meeting. It's all fake news. It's phony stuff. It didn't happen. And it was gotten by opponents of ours. It's an amazing location, and Moscow.
America's intelligence agencies are investigating a dossier compiled by a former British spy, alleging that Donald Trump, on a visit to Russia, engaged in personal behavior that left him deeply compromised. It was an issue I put directly to him. Can you make clear whether during your visits to either Moscow or St. Petersburg you engaged in conduct that you now regret, and that would a reasonable observer say that you are potentially vulnerable to blackmail by Russia or by its intelligence agencies?
Let me just tell you what I do. When I leave our country, I'm a very high-profile person, would you say? I am extremely careful. I'm surrounded by bodyguards. I'm surrounded by people. And I always tell them, anywhere, but I always tell them, if I'm leaving this country, be very careful, because in your hotel rooms, and no matter where you go, you're going to probably have cameras. I'm not referring just to Russia, but I would certainly put them in that category. And again, not just Russia, all over. Does anyone really believe that story? I'm also very much of a germaphobe, by the way. Believe me.
That reference to being a germaphobe was an attempt to hit back at lurid allegations about what may have happened at this Moscow hotel and in this presidential suite when Trump stayed here. But the unverified claims are not just about salacious personal conduct. There are also suggestions that Trump and his advisors, including his former campaign chief Paul Manafort, have been hiding a covert political relationship with the Kremlin, including changing policy positions in return for hacked information on Hillary Clinton.
And it was actually pretty accurate.
Trump also ramped up his attack on the very intelligence agencies that will soon guide him, making a startling comparison with the Third Reich.
I think it was disgraceful that the intelligence agencies allowed any information that turned out to be so false and fake out. I think it's a disgrace. And I say that, and that's something that Nazi Germany would have done and did do. I think it's a disgrace.
Trump's relationship with major TV networks has now become highly confrontational.
President-elect,
ahead.
President-elect, since you are attacking our news organization, can you give us a chance? Can you give us a question? You're attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude.
Can you give us a question?
I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you stay categorically?
You are fake news. Go ahead.
It leaves the transition in turmoil. An incoming president in a war of sorts with his own intelligence agencies, even his own loyalties in question. A storm that is certain to follow him into the Oval Office. Robert Moore, News at 10, New York.
And it wasn't just Mr. Trump who was denying the claims in that Russian dossier. The Russians said no such surveillance had been carried out. So both Mr. Trump and Moscow were singing from the same hymn sheet, and the language they used showed remarkable symmetry, as NBC's Bill Neely in Moscow told us a little earlier this evening.
Well, this frankly extraordinary day began with another series of denials here in Moscow from the official Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who called those allegations that Russian officials collected salacious information about Donald Trump utter nonsense. He said they were a total hoax and pulp fiction. He claims Russia doesn't collect salacious information on anyone, and he said the dossier, which he called a hoax, was an attempt to divide the US and Russia. What I find interesting were the echoes in the language used by Peskov and Trump. So Peskov talked about a total hoax and a witch hunt. Trump stated this was all fake news and a witch hunt. But you know, this is an absolutely extraordinary, unprecedented situation where an incoming US president is using Kremlin statements to defend himself. And the Kremlin is defending that incoming president by talking about a political witch hunt whipped up with hysteria. And you know, the hawks in this city will be absolutely delighted at the disarray in Washington, at the divisions which Donald Trump played on again today between the incoming president and the US intelligence community. That will delight the hawks in Russia.
Well, Bill Neely in Moscow there. Let's return now to New York and Robert Moore, who joins us from Trump Tower, where that extraordinary news conference was held. Robert, I mean, bizarre doesn't perhaps even begin to describe today, but what's your take on it?
Well, look, it was, Tom, it was classic Donald Trump. We've seen it on the campaign trail for 18 months. It was provocative, it was highly unconventional. Look, at times it was simply outrageous, such as comparison of aspects of American life with Nazi Germany. Astonishing, given that this is a man who in 8 or 9 days' time is going to be inaugurated as America's 45th president. And on the CIA, I mean, that was kind of baffling as well. I mean, this is a man who is treating his own intelligence agencies as if they're a foreign intelligence service. Not the kind of main source of valuable information for him as he goes forward as commander-in-chief. And on Russia, well, look, you heard him say to me very clearly there is nothing he did in Russia that makes him vulnerable to blackmail by Moscow's intelligence agencies. He went on to say that actually if he becomes a friend of Vladimir Putin, if they get on well, that is actually only good news. The bottom line, I think, is that the allegations and reports here are not going to go away. So for millions of Americans, combine this with the fact that he lost a popular vote, and you know, they will regard Donald Trump as entering the Oval Office with something of a crisis of legitimacy. It's very rare that we could say that for millions of Americans, they're not just doubting his politics, they're actually doubting his allegiance and his very loyalties.
All right, extraordinary day, Robert. Thank you very much indeed. So if, as we mentioned earlier, a former British spy was involved in compiling the dossier against Mr. Trump, what more can we say about him tonight? Well, our security editor, Rohit Katru, is here. I mean, Rohit, in essence, who is this man and how reliable do you think his information was?
Well, Tom, in the last few moments, restrictions which have previously prevented him from identifying him have been lifted. And so tonight I can report that he is Christopher David Steele. He's a former officer with MI6. He was posted to Moscow in 1990. In more recent years, though, he has run a private intelligence organisation. He is a joint director there, and that reminds us that this piece of intelligence is a private enterprise from a private company, private research. And so is it credible? Should we believe the allegations? Well, President-elect Trump today called the publisher of this dossier today a failing pile of garbage. But let's put aside the bluster, let's put aside the distractions and consider, do intelligence agencies get it wrong? Yes, they do, all the time. Do they sway with political influence? Well, perhaps they often do. But would they, in the United States, get in the president and the president-elect to look him in the eye and share these lurid allegations based on a piece of gossip, a piece of unfounded intelligence? Well, that would be fairly unlikely. And so the very fact that they have done this means that, although it may not be true, it does indicate to all of us that they are certainly taking this, the allegations and the implications of the allegations, incredibly seriously at this point, Tom.
Rohit, something tells me we will be talking about this again. But for now, thank you very much indeed. Well, as Donald Trump counts down to moving into the White House, Barack Obama is getting ready to leave. He was pretty reflective in his farewell speech last night. He chose to deliver it in Chicago, the place that became his kind of town when he first made a name in politics. He was a little fearful about what a Trump presidency might hold and a little tearful as he thanked his wife, Michelle. But the old oratory still shone. His campaign slogan, "Yes, we can," refashioned as "Yes, we did."
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama.
For his final farewell, Barack Obama went back to where it all began. He loves Chicago, and his adopted hometown loves him back. His time in office, he said, hadn't been easy, but he looks back now with pride.
If I had told you that we would open up a new chapter with the Cuban people, shut down Iran's nuclear weapons program without firing a shot, take out the mastermind of 9/11. If I had told you that we would win marriage equality and secure the right to health insurance for another 20 million of our fellow citizens, if I had told you all that, you might have said our sights were set a little too high.
He barely mentioned Donald Trump by name, but he did call on people to step up if the going gets tough.
If you're disappointed by your elected officials, grab a clipboard, get some signatures, and run for office yourself.
It hadn't been an emotional speech, but then the president turned his attention to the woman who made this journey with him.
You took on a role you didn't ask for, and you made it your own, with grace and with grit and with style and good humor.
The first family joined the president on stage, and together they bid the country goodbye.
You can feel the adoration for President Obama in this room. He is always impressive at events like this. But America must now prepare to bid farewell to Obama, the orator, and prepare to welcome a new president whose method of communication and whose message could not be more different.
A great many Americans will miss the president with the common touch, a man who bore the burden of his office with good grace and good humour. Obama's approval ratings are still high. If he had been able to stand for a third term, he may well have won.
I think he'll be remembered as someone who brought dignity and integrity to this office, and at a time when it badly needed that. So,
how is the country now at the end of his term?
An upward trajectory. We have more jobs, more health care, more hope.
Hope was the mantra President Obama brought with him 8 years ago, and as he walks out of office, hope remains the message he leaves behind. Martin Geisler, News at 10, Chicago.
Well, one man with some firm views on President Obama, and not all of them complimentary, is General David Petraeus. Mr. Obama put him in charge of NATO forces in Afghanistan for a time, and he was later, of course, made director of the CIA. Today, I spoke to him about both the outgoing and the incoming presidents. I began by asking him how historians would reflect on President Obama's time in office.
Well, I think that they will assess that he provided leadership that, as with all presidents, I think evolved over time. He was an individual who was elected, of course, to end wars. That was certainly his perspective, and I think the view of the electorate.
The president's critics would say, as you know, that the moment he didn't respond when President Assad crossed one of his red lines on the use of chemical weapons in Syria was a moment when America retreated from the world stage. Do you think there's something in that?
There's something in it. There's no question that there was a questioning of American commitment, if you will, after that. And I think a lot of the critiquing of the administration will focus on Syria and what might or might not have been done at different times when decisions weren't taken, and so on. All of those always, of course, with great uncertainty and never with any guarantees that if X, Y, or Z was done, that it would guarantee the desired outcome.
Can I turn to today? We have a man about to walk into the White House as president who's effectively been accused today of being, in hoc to a foreign power, and a hostile one at that. How credible do you think these allegations are? If you were still head of the CIA, would you be putting this in front of the president as a briefing?
Well, they, of course, have been put in front of the current president and the president-elect. No one really, I don't think, has a firm grip on the credibility of the sources that are involved in this. And I think it's going to take a good bit more analysis to determine if there really is credibility to these different assertions, these different allegations.
Are you worried at this point that he's about to assume the presidency, or do you think he will acquit himself pretty decently from what you've seen so far?
Well, all I can go on is my own interaction with him in the fairly long conversation we had when I was privileged to be considered for the position of Secretary of State. And my sense, in a word, was that he was pragmatic. But certainly, I mean, he will also, in some respects, be the disruptor in chief. And one hopes that that is disruption, if you will, that ends up being positive.
We tend to look at President Obama and President-elect Trump, and we see vastly different men. And quite honestly, I think we're braced for quite a dramatic change in America's conduct, really, in the world. But you know both men. Do you think, in reality, the changes won't be as dramatic and abrupt as some of us think they might be?
Well, certainly there will be significant changes in a number of different respects. Again, President Trump, when he assumes office, I assume will not stop tweeting. This communication directly to the population is something that is quite different in many respects. It's not to say the White House hasn't had social media sites and so forth, but these are clearly coming directly from him. And so you may see a policy evolve where it is actually led by a tweet. And so there will be an intense focus on that medium of communication.
General David Petraeus talking to me earlier from New York. Now, in the past 5 days, the 5 little letters NHS and A&E have achieved the rare distinction of eclipsing Brexit on the domestic political agenda. In all the arguments, the government's defence is that it is providing the NHS in England with more money than it has asked for. But today that argument was undermined by the man who's actually asking for the money. The normally even-handed head of NHS England, Simon Stevens, openly contradicted the Prime Minister.
Is there a pill to cure Theresa May's NHS pain? The charge that our health service is close to collapse. Well, today the boss of the NHS in England made her headache even worse by contradicting her claim that hospitals and GPs have got all the cash they wanted and needed.
Like probably every part of the public service, we got less than we asked for in that process. And so I think it would be stretching it to say that the NHS has got more than it has asked for.
Which means, he said, that hospitals will be on the critical list for years.
And in 2018-19, as I previously said in October, real terms NHS spending per person in England is going to go down 10 years after Lehman Brothers and austerity began. We all understand why that is, but let's not pretend that that's not placing huge pressure on the service.
Now, the moment that could have come straight out of a soap opera like Casualty was when Simon Stevens contradicted his civil service colleague Chris Wormold, who runs the Department of Health.
I hate to ever disagree with Chris, but I think this is that's one lens on it, and I think the Daily Mail got this right in November when they pointed out that the NHS trails the rest of Europe with what we're spending on doctors and beds and scanners.
And official statistics show that health spending per person is 10% more in France than in the UK, 32% more in Germany, and a staggering 73% more in Switzerland. So, the symptoms of our malaise?
I accept there have been a small number of incidents where where unacceptable practices have taken place.
But the apparent misery of patients provided Labour's bruised leader with a much-needed balm.
Earlier this week, the Prime Minister said she wanted to create a shared society. Well, we've certainly got that. More people sharing hospital corridors on trolleys. More people sharing waiting areas at A&E departments.
An emergency. Well, that's what many doctors and nurses say, but I understand the Prime Minister isn't going to be panicked into an emergency injection of extra money. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Now, the 15-year-old girl suspected of murdering a younger girl, a 7-year-old, appeared in a magistrate's court today in York, the city where the killing took place. The teenager's next appearance will be in Leeds Crown Court on Friday. In the meantime, she is in secure accommodation. Katie Ruff was found dying on a playing field on Monday evening. She was mentioned in Parliament today during Prime Minister's questions. New milestones on the financial markets were passed today because of the lingering impact of the Brexit vote and the anticipation of the Trump presidency, which we were reporting on, of course, earlier. The pound fell against the dollar to its lowest level for months. Our economics editor, Narina Hertz, is here. Narina, I think at the dawn of this year, we're all rather wondering, aren't we, where the economy is taking us. It was a bit of a topsy-turvy day. Maybe you could just give us the basic story first.
Yes, the pound did have quite a tumultuous day. At one point, it fell to a 31-year low against the dollar, but it wasn't a Brexit story today. Today was really all about Trump's press conference. Just before the press conference, the markets were very excited to hear the president-elect's speech, and the dollar strengthened against not just the pound, but against the euro, the Canadian dollar, the Japanese yen. As the president spoke, the dollar got weaker and weaker because he was attacking business. He was attacking Big Pharma, telling them that they're getting away with murder. He was attacking the car manufacturers who are manufacturing in Mexico. He was attacking Lockheed Martin. And the markets don't like anyone attacking business, let alone the president-elect.
And I guess it's not what they expect from him. And we talked endlessly about Trump, and we've talked about Trump a lot tonight. What we haven't talked about much is what Trumponomics, that's the right word, probably isn't.
It's my word.
OK, it's your word, it's a good word. What does that mean for all of us? Massive, important economy. What are his policies going to mean for all of us, do you think?
Well, he's got a multi-pronged approach from what we know so far. Of course, he's rather unpredictable. What we know so far, he's planning a massive fiscal stimulus, trillion-dollar infrastructure spending. He's planning tax cuts on corporations. He's planning to deregulate some of the financial services that were regulated after the financial crisis. Now, the markets think this is going to be great, and in fact, it may be that there's a sugar rush kind of a year for the US in which things do look good, but just think about how much debt might be being racked up. And then the fourth prong to his approach is trade barriers, trade tariffs, starting perhaps a trade war even against China, against Mexico. Perhaps the whole world will start getting into a tit-for-tat when it comes to trade. And that would be very damaging, not only for America, but for the global economy as a whole.
It's going to be, as we keep saying, it's going to be an interesting year. And I'm sure we'll be talking about it a lot. But Narina, for now, thank you very much indeed. Now, back here still, the TV entertainer Rolf Harris, who's already behind bars for sex abuse, was on another court video link today as details of a new set of alleged assaults were outlined to a jury. They included claims of 7 such assaults on girls and women from 12, 13 and 14-year-old fans to a blind and disabled woman. The alleged attacks are said to have taken place in public between 1971 and 2004. It shouldn't be surprising, I guess. It is January after all, but the worst winter weather of the year so far, strong winds and falling snow, has blasted parts of Britain today. Electricity supplies have been cut, the Forth Road Bridge was closed almost all day, and a section of Newcastle city centre still is.
one of the main arteries into Edinburgh blocked by a truck blown over in gale force winds. The Forth Road Bridge shut in both directions all day, causing traffic chaos around the city. The single greatest impact of the high winds which have battered the northeast of Scotland and England. The bridge closed to high-sided vehicles at the time, efforts to recover the truck hampered by high winds. And there's more to come. Forecasters predict the arrival of a belt of very cold weather over the next 24 hours, bringing ice and snow to Scotland and northern England, and possibly the south too.
With that wet weather coming in across more southern areas of England and Wales, with the risk of some snow on its northern edge, certainly we're keeping an eye on things to see how it will progress.
Today's gusts, with some recorded at over 70 miles an hour, came as a shock to some. One of Newcastle's busiest shopping streets had to be closed because of construction debris blowing from the roofs. In Yorkshire and further north, the threat of falling trees, hundreds of homes without power and hazardous driving conditions. This road in Gateshead barred by a stable blown into the middle of it.
At one point I did think, oh God, I hope those stables don't blow away, but I didn't actually think they would. I went to work and then got a phone call from my mum saying the stables had blocked the road off and the police were holding the road.
Whether or not the country will see this phenomenon, known as thunder snow, predicted by some, the north will have to be braced for the worst. Here in County Durham, the bad weather has already arrived with temperatures just above zero, a biting wind and flurries of sleet. Just how bad this weather becomes depends on how much further the temperature falls and how much of this sleet falls as snow. But in Scotland this evening, recovery workers finally managed to remove the overturned truck from the Forth Bridge, just hours before the arrival of the very worst of the weather. Damon Green, News at 10.
And finally, in her royal finery, this is pretty much how most of us think of Queen Elizabeth I. And yet, despite her known enjoyment of clothes, none of them has survived through history, or so we thought. Until one day, an expert on Tudor clothing spotted what was said to be an altar cloth hanging on the wall of a Herefordshire church. Turns out it was probably made from one of Elizabeth's skirts, maybe even the one in this very portrait.
For many years it had taken pride of place as an altar cloth at a small church in rural Herefordshire, a gift to a devoted lady-in-waiting from her beloved monarch. But until now, no one had known just how rare it was. After detailed detective work, experts now believe this is the only surviving piece of clothing worn by Elizabeth I.
Nothing else exists so far. This is, at the moment, one of its kind.
Curator Ellery Lynn visited the church during research and identified the cloth's value through the style of embroidery, the botanical pattern and the fact that cloth of silver and gold is used.
This is done by professional hand, which means that the person who was able to commission this is incredibly high status. So we're already dealing with an item of court dress. It's actually embroidered on cloth of silver. And by Tudor sumptuary law, this was actually reserved only for the immediate members of the royal family. And of course, if you're looking at sort of a late 16th century member of the royal family, that's just Elizabeth.
It's thought it could even have been part of this outfit worn in this famous portrait of the Tudor Queen. Depictions of her in films have accurately portrayed her sumptuous wardrobe. The best fabrics in Europe and beyond were given to her. But later her clothing was sold off or the fabric was cut up and reused. She was, however, known to have given clothes to her favourite lady-in-waiting, Blanche Perry, a parishioner in the village of Bacton in Herefordshire. For centuries it was used on the altar and then hung on the wall.
Well, we always thought it was from Queen Elizabeth I, one of her dresses, but we could never get provenance from it. And then when Ellery Lynn and Emma Henny came down, they walked through the door of the church and they went, wow. And it was immediately obvious that it was the genuine article.
The skirt is now back for restoration at Hampton Court Palace, where the Queen may well have worn it and where later it will be put on display. Nina Nanar, News at 10.
Let's just take a quick look at tomorrow, though. With Mr. Trump around, I'm not sure there's much point in making predictions, but here we are. There will be more scrutiny here, at least, of A&E departments and English hospitals when the monthly figures for November come out. And Michelle Obama will be making her last appearance as First Lady. I'll be here for all that, but for now, good night, and thank you very much for watching.